we can develop a psychosis about it, or a neurosis. Become completely neurotic in judging and condemning ourselves. And so we have to be a little bit careful about even judging ourselves too much. That's one reason for coming to confession also, in proper confession, is so you don't judge yourself too harshly. And one of the most important things in confession is to help you forgive yourself. Because you get God's forgiveness, but sometimes we don't forgive ourselves. And then we have this guilt hanging on us, and it begins to crush our spirit. And if God has forgiven us, how dare we not forgive ourselves? But sometimes we need help forgiving ourselves. And that's a part of what confession is also.
It's actually the most important question for me. How to balance self-love and sacrificing myself for other people.
Well, first of all, we have to divide self-esteem from self-love. Because a person has to have a reasonable amount of self-esteem to be human. One of the problems even in marriage is when one party doesn't have self-esteem and they start dragging the other person in the family down because they go into depression about it. On the other hand, self-esteem can take us into what's called vainglory, which is really what the Pharisees had. They have too much self-esteem. It wasn't just... And the main source of our self-esteem is that Jesus Christ loved each one of us enough to die for us. And if Christ loved us that much, of course we should have some self-esteem. Because Christ loved us that much for us. And that's part of the message too. It isn't all about... Apostle Paul tells us that we have not been given in bondage to a spirit of fear. And remember the Apostle John, the beloved apostle, in his first epistle tells us, whoever still has fear has not yet learned how to love. Because perfect love drives out fear, because fear has torment. So fear is for spiritual infants or babies. And as you mature in the faith, the fear changes into love. And this is why St. Abba Anthony the Great, on the scroll that he holds in icon, he said, I used to fear God, but now I love him. So when I was a spiritual infant and I didn't really know God, I feared him. But now that I know God and I'm spiritually mature, I love God. And that's really a message to us as well. So it's difficult, but that's another thing that confession is about, because sometimes we're confused about, have I gone too far with something? And do I need to change my attitude toward it? And we should be able to hear that in confession. See, too often people think confession is just, oh, I broke this law, I broke that law, I did this, I did that, or some action you took. But really confession should be about everything that burdens your heart. And everything that causes you grief or that weighs you down or that weighs on your mind. So confession should be more full, more complete. And we lost that because we became like, I don't know where we got this idea that confession was just about like a criminal court. The priest is not a prosecuting attorney. The priest is supposed to be a spiritual healer, not a prosecuting attorney. And so we have to even rethink how we approach confession. But these problems come up, and even in family problems. So it's good to come to confession and talk them over. So you have something?
Yeah, it was related with the question before, but you already answered to it while you discussed. But I have something else as well. It's more like a comment on what I tend to think. I tend to think that every person, when he came to life, in his conscience is everything written, all the rules, all of good, of doing well. But then in life, you tend to separate from those, because every time you do something wrong, you feel it's wrong. It's your conscience. It's not a rule that you read somewhere. Even if you're not Christian, but you are a good people, you feel inside it's something wrong. So this is what I tend to think.
Yeah, well, that's why part of what we're doing even in confession is trying to heal your relationship with your conscience, to give you a clear relationship with your conscience. Because St. Cyril of Jerusalem tells us that our conscience is going to be our judge when we depart this life. Our conscience tells us what our relationship is with Christ when we depart this life. And the conscience is something like a holy prophet that's planted in all human beings by God's grace. Every human being has conscience. And you can struggle against your conscience sometimes. You know, if you can become what they call a psychopath who doesn't have a relationship with conscience. And your conscience is a guide to you. And the one thing we have to be cautious of, though, is not to let our conscience, or what we think our conscience is saying, try to govern somebody else's life. Because sometimes something is wrong for us, but it's not wrong for somebody else. You know, for example, it's not wrong for a single person to fall in love with a woman, but not with somebody else's wife. or you know, this is the thing. We're not all born alike, and we have some very profound differences, things that are hardwired into our brain. They can't be changed after we're born at all. And I know there was recently an article about it. How do really good parents who've had 3 or 4 good children all of a sudden produce a toxic child? How come a toxic child is born and grows up toxic, you know, with a very nasty personality toward people and everything, and just can't really make friends or anything else? Because it's hardwired into their brain before they're born, so no matter how you raise them, it's not going to change. There are things like that we have to realize and recognize as well. And, you know, they have to be dealt with in different spiritual ways. But so, consequently, you know, we have to think, when we talk about purification of the heart, what we're really ultimately talking about is purification of our relationship with our conscience. Because that's why you find good people everywhere in this world. Doesn't matter what race or religion or whatever. You still find very good people who care about other people and respond to other people's needs. Because everyone has a conscience that's given by grace from God. And when we, as Orthodox Christians, we're perhaps more responsible to respond to our conscience, because we kind of understand what it's all about. So this is, when we talk about purification of the heart, we talk about the prayer of the heart, the prayer of the guarding of the mind. We're talking about our relationship with our conscience and how to have a careful relationship with our own conscience. And so it's true, the conscience is there for everyone. And how we respond to it has a lot to do with what we experience when we depart this life too. Anybody else have a question? How about you, Barry?
Well, I have like some observations, and like I noticed some people they sort of have a false conscience, like they try to do all these things and they try to appear like they're being a very conscious person and doing all these kind of things, but they're really just doing it because they want to appear that way. And it's kind of a fun line, I guess, but like they're doing it for their own personal gain. It's just something I've noticed in some people.
Yeah, well, that's what the parable of the Pharisee and the publican was about. And the other thing is sometimes people say, oh, well, I'm waiting for God's will. What they mean is I want to do what I want to do regardless of what God wants, and I'm waiting for an excuse so I can claim it's God's will. Sometimes you have to take your own decision and take it in accordance with a sincere conscience. That's the main part of it. So how about you? Any questions?
He has very big one.
It's probably for the next very big question.
Yeah, well, sometimes, you know, we have to expand on some of these things that people bring up when we do YouTube broadcasts as well. But really, just to look at the spiritual life itself and what we're trying to gain and acquire from it. I mentioned before that some people take the chotki or the prayer rope, and they think if they pass enough knots past their hand, they'll be able to float in the air or walk on water or something.